Daniel Hayes, a billionaire who had always believed success was measured by wealth, decided to volunteer anonymously at a local food distribution center to understand the people his foundation helped. There, he met Evan, a humble delivery driver who gave far more than he had, challenging Daniel's views on generosity and purpose. But when Daniel uncovered a secret Evan had been hiding, he realized that the path ahead would change both their lives in ways they never saw coming. Welcome to Limelight Tales. What happens when a billionaire's path crosses with his loyal driver in a life-changing moment? The winter sun struggled to break through the dense clouds that hung low over the city. At the bustling food distribution center in a modest part of town, volunteers were working tirelessly, unpacking donations and organizing supplies for families in need. Among them was Daniel Hayes, though no one recognized him. Gone were his tailored suits and the aura of wealth he carried in the corporate world. Clad in worn jeans and a plain hoodie, Daniel blended seamlessly into the crowd. This was his first time volunteering anonymously, a decision born out of a restless curiosity to connect with the people his foundation claimed to help. Daniel had spent years as a philanthropist, but his contributions had often been filtered through intermediaries, managers, directors, and charitable organizations. He realized that he had never truly understood the struggles of those who benefited from his generosity. Today, standing shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, he felt a mix of discomfort and anticipation. As Daniel stacked boxes of canned goods, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A man in a faded delivery uniform had entered, balancing two large grocery bags. He moved quickly, setting the bags down at the donation counter. Despite his obvious fatigue, he wore a determined expression. Daniel watched as one of the older volunteers, a kind woman named Ruth, approached the man. "Evan, what's all this?" Ruth asked, her voice tinged with concern. "You shouldn't be bringing so much. You've got your own family to take care of." Evan smiled and wiped his hands on his trousers. "It's not much, really. Just some groceries I picked up on sale. My wife and I talked about it, and we can stretch what we have for a while. There are folks here who don't have that option." Daniel felt a flicker of curiosity. He stepped closer, pretending to busy himself with a clipboard. "That's very generous of you," he said, trying to sound casual. "But it must be tough, giving away so much when you have your own family to think about." Evan glanced at Daniel, his gaze steady but warm. "It's not easy, but I know what it's like to be on the other side. My wife and I grew up with very little. We learned to make do, and we also learned how much of a difference it makes when someone shows a little kindness." The simplicity of Evan's words struck Daniel deeply. He wasn't used to such humility, especially from someone who clearly had so little. Over the next few hours, Daniel kept an eye on Evan, observing how he interacted with others. Evan was a quiet but steady presence, always stepping in to help without being asked. He spoke kindly to everyone, offering encouragement and sharing laughs with those who needed it. Later, during a short break, Daniel found himself sitting next to Evan in the crowded staff area. The man had a sandwich in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Daniel hesitated for a moment before striking up a conversation. "Do you volunteer here often?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Evan nodded, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "Every chance I get. It's not always much, but I try to do what I can. My wife thinks I go overboard sometimes, but she understands why it's important to me." "Your wife sounds supportive," Daniel said, genuinely intrigued. "And your kids? How do they feel about it?" "They're too young to fully understand," Evan admitted, smiling. "Emma's 9, and Leo just turned 6. They're great kids, always sharing, always looking out for each other. I think they've picked up on what we're trying to teach them, that life isn't just about what you have, but what you can give. Daniel listened intently, feeling a strange mix of admiration and guilt. Here was a man who had every reason to hold on tightly to what little he had, yet he gave freely and without hesitation. It was a stark contrast to Daniel's own life, where wealth had always been a buffer, insulating him from the kind of sacrifices Evan described. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Daniel couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. That night, as he sat in his sprawling penthouse apartment, surrounded by every luxury imaginable, he felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. He thought of Evan's tired but resolute face, of his willingness to give when he had so little. For the first time in years, Daniel questioned the true impact of his philanthropy. Was he really making a difference? Or was he just throwing money at problems from a safe distance? The next morning, Daniel returned to the food center, his mind made up. This time, he wasn't just a volunteer. He gathered everyone together, revealing his true identity. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the volunteers recognized him. "I came here to learn," Daniel began, his voice steady but emotional. "To see the struggles and the strength of the people we often talk about in boardrooms. Yesterday, I met someone who reminded me of what true generosity looks like." Daniel turned to Evan, who looked stunned. "Your story moved me deeply," he continued. "You give so much, not because you have to, but because you want to. That kind of compassion is rare, and it deserves to be celebrated." Daniel announced the creation of a new initiative, the Evan Grant, a program that would provide monthly grocery allowances to low-income families. The room erupted in applause, but Evan looked overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say," Evan stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't do anything special." Daniel shook his head. "You reminded me, and everyone here, that true generosity comes from the heart, not from wealth or resources. You've inspired me, Evan, and I'm grateful for that." As the volunteers celebrated the announcement, Evan stood in stunned silence, his mind racing. He had never sought recognition, and yet his quiet sacrifices had sparked something far greater than he could have imagined. As the applause in the food distribution center began to fade, Daniel watched Evan, whose face was a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and quiet humility. The announcement of the Evan Grant had taken everyone by surprise, but it was clear to Daniel that this was only the beginning. He had seen something rare in Evan, a kind of selflessness that was all too uncommon in the world Daniel came from. When the crowd began to disperse, Evan approached Daniel hesitantly. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I don't know how to thank you for this, but I'm not sure I deserve it. I'm just doing what anyone else would do." Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong, Evan. Most people wouldn't do what you do. You're not just giving away food, you're giving people hope. And hope is something money alone can't buy." Evan nodded, still looking uncertain. Before he could respond, Ruth appeared with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Here," she said, handing one to each of them. "You two could use a moment to sit down and talk. Evan, this man isn't going to bite. And Mr. Hayes, you'll want to hear more about this guy." She winked before walking away. They sat down at a small table near the back of the center. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me something, Evan. What's your dream? If you didn't have to worry about money or work, what would you want to do?" Evan hesitated, as though the question had caught him off guard. "I don't think about that much," he admitted. Life doesn't leave a lot of room for dreams when you're just trying to make it to the next day. Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of Evan's words. But if you could, he pressed. Evan stared into his coffee cup, the steam curling upward as he thought. I guess I'd want to start something that lasts. A community kitchen, maybe. A place where anyone can come and eat without worrying about how to pay. My wife and I talk about it sometimes, but it's always been more of a wish than a plan. The sincerity in Evan's voice struck Daniel deeply. He could see that this wasn't just idle talk. It was a dream born from years of hardship and a desire to help others avoid the same struggles. You know, Daniel said after a moment, that sounds like something worth pursuing. What if I helped you make it happen? Evan blinked, startled. What do you mean? I mean, let's turn that dream into a reality, Daniel said. I'll fund the kitchen, and you'll run it. You already know what this community needs better than anyone else. Together, we could create something truly meaningful. Evan's hands tightened around his coffee cup. That's a lot to take in. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. Daniel smiled reassuringly. You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. Talk it over with your wife. If you're willing, I'll make sure you have all the resources you need to get started. The days that followed were a whirlwind. News of the Evan grant spread across the city, drawing attention from local media and community leaders. Donations began pouring in, and families who had long struggled with food insecurity started to breathe a little easier. Evan, however, found himself grappling with the enormity of what Daniel had proposed. The idea of running a community kitchen both excited and terrified him. He discussed it with his wife, Lisa, over late-night cups of tea after their children had gone to bed. Do you think we can do this? He asked her one night, his voice tinged with doubt. Lisa reached across the table, placing her hand over his. I think you've been ready for this your whole life. You've always wanted to help people, Evan. Now you have someone willing to help you do it. Encouraged by her faith in him, Evan finally agreed to Daniel's proposal. The next week, the two men sat down to outline their plans. Daniel secured a building, a small but sturdy space in the heart of the neighborhood, and hired a team of contractors to renovate it. Evan, in turn, began reaching out to local farmers, grocers, and volunteers to build partnerships and secure food donations. Months later, the community kitchen opened its doors. The line stretched down the block as families, individuals, and even curious passers-by gathered to see what had been created. Evan stood at the entrance, greeting each person with a warm smile as Lisa and the children helped serve the first meals. Daniel watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. He had always thought his wealth defined him, but seeing Evan in his element, radiating joy and purpose, made him realize that true wealth was measured by the lives you touched. The kitchen quickly became more than just a place to eat. It was a hub of connection and support, where neighbors looked out for one another and strangers became friends. Evan's dream had become a lifeline for countless people, and Daniel knew this was only the beginning of what they could achieve together. But life rarely follows a smooth path. As the community kitchen flourished, new challenges began to emerge. Challenges that would test Evan, Daniel, and the fragile bonds of their partnership in ways they never anticipated. The community kitchen had become a beacon of hope. Every evening, the laughter of children and the hum of conversations filled the once empty building. Families shared meals, friendships blossomed, and the air was thick with gratitude. Evan, wearing an apron stained with flour and sauce, stood behind the counter, serving plates of steaming food. Lisa and the children bustled around, helping wherever they could. It was chaotic, but it was beautiful. Daniel, watching from a corner table, felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The man who had once lived in penthouses and boardrooms now found himself most at peace in this simple, lively space. As he observed Evan's kindness in action, he felt his own life had been profoundly changed. That night, as the last family left, Evan walked over to Daniel, who was wiping down tables. "You didn't have to stay and clean," Evan said, chuckling. Daniel looked up and smiled. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." Evan hesitated, then sat down across from him. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, his voice soft. "This kitchen, it's not just a place for others. It saved me, too. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. And I couldn't have done it without you." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He shook his head. "You were already doing it, Evan. All I did was give you a little push. You're the heart of this place." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around them. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the streets in quiet serenity. As they locked up for the night, Evan turned to Daniel. "You know, I've always believed that a single act of kindness can change the world. You proved me right." Daniel smiled, his eyes glistening. "No, Evan, you proved me wrong. I used to think money was what changed the world, but you showed me that it's people. People like you." And as they walked out into the snowy night, the light from the kitchen's windows spilled onto the street. A reminder that hope, when shared, could shine far brighter than any fortune ever could. Life has a way of revealing its most profound truths in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it's not about the grand plans we make or the successes we achieve, but about the moments where everything falls into place, where passion and purpose align in the most ordinary settings. In those moments, we realize that the greatest rewards don't come from seeking recognition or accolades, but from the simple satisfaction of knowing we've made a difference, not just in the world, but in the lives of those around us. The true measure of success is found in the connections we create and the lasting impact we leave, no matter how small it may seem. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep the stories coming. And remember, sometimes the most unexpected moments can change everything. Stay tuned to discover the power of every untold tale.